Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. As regular listeners will know, one of our main focal points on this podcast is that our actions flow from who we are. With that, we seek to ask not only what it means to do justice, but what it means to be a people of justice. Built in here is a question about formation. Christians around the world are seeking to be formed into Christ-likeness, taking seriously their role as members of God's kingdom. But differences in theology and culture can lead us to different viewpoints, emphases, and practices in our lives as Christians. It seems, especially here in the United States, like these differences often sound an alarm for Christians. Rather than seeking to learn and understand where these differences come from and how they interact, we travel down a path of trying to determine what is right and wrong, often landing in a place where anything that is different from our norm is wrong. But there's a different biblical call here we can lean on when we discover difference, one that Paul refers to as becoming all things, and one which forms the basis of our conversation with today's guest, Dr. Michelle Amir Reyes. Dr. Reyes is an intercultural leadership coach, the award-winning author of Becoming All Things: How Small Changes Lead to Lasting Connections Across Cultures, and a certified cultural intelligence or CQ trainer. She helps leaders engage across difference with confidence and care, not guilt or shame. You can get her free cultural competence quiz when you subscribe to her Substack, Success Culture. I was struck by a number of things from Dr. Reyes' book. The first being how well she explores what it means to discover both who we are and what we do. The second is how fully Paul's admonition to become all things to all people informs her presentation of cross-cultural interaction. And third, how well she balances an understanding that cultural intelligence is an important tool for evangelism with the understanding that everyone with whom we interact is a human with dignity and worth, not just a body to be evangelized. Now, if you will, join us as we explore each of these ideas and more with Dr. Michelle Amir Reyes. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources Podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Dr. Reyes, thank you for joining me here today.
Hey, Eric, thanks for having me.
It's good, like we were just saying before, it's good to connect with you, but it's interesting that it's happening while you're living abroad rather than us living in the same state.
I know. It's so cool that we're both from Minnesota, or that you're in Minnesota right now. But yeah, our family moved last fall of 2025 to England. So we are getting closer to the 1 year mark. We're in Birmingham, England, which is a couple hours north of London, and we're loving it here.
Nice. I'm curious, we're going to be talking about cross-cultural intelligence, cross-cultural interaction, things like that today. I'm curious what it's like to be living abroad, with that being sort of your vocational background and focus.
Yeah. It's, oh man, so many thoughts come to mind. But what I think something that is really interesting is just an identity shift that both my husband and I have experienced in moving here to England. As I write in my book, in Becoming All Things, most of my life I've always been seen as an ethnic minority, as an Indian American woman. In America, there is this very strong racial interpretive lens that we live under almost like a microscope, if you will, and people can be very obsessed with categorizing you, and trying to figure you out even before they get to know you. And so I was always like the brown girl or the brown skinned Indian in America, and all the assumptions and stereotypes that come with that. But here, and particularly in Birmingham, where we live, where there's a really high South Asian population, it's the first time in my life where I've kind of fit into the crowd, and people don't look at me like I'm different or have those questions of like, where are you from? Or are you from India? Or do you like naan? Like, I'm not getting the same kind of interactions that I would in America. And in fact, people generally just see us as the Americans, which has a whole different sort of connotation with it. And so I will say I've actually come to enjoy it because there's a new level of anonymity, and maybe even just like the pressure is off to be more of myself without anyone trying to categorize us. So there's a lot of freedom, and especially in this big wave of more and more Americans wanting to move abroad. Um, Obviously, not for everyone, but we have just really enjoyed the freedom of being more of ourselves here in England than I think my husband and I have ever felt while living in the States.
That's so interesting. For the listener, I'll break in here and say we'll get to some more foundational things, but I want to kind of chase this rabbit trail, if you will,
Yeah.
because I don't know enough about England or their culture or history to speak super intelligently on it. But it seems like they are more connected to what they would describe as the Commonwealth, like
Yeah.
all of the parts that used to be part of the British Empire, the colonial connections, if you will. And India,
Yeah.
I guess, is one of those places, along with around the world. It seems like they are
Yes.
more connected in that way than Americans are to anywhere outside of the United States. Well, I guess particularly white Americans. I guess it would depend on where you have immigrated from and sort of that how you view your history personally. Is that something
Yes.
you're noticing? Like, how does that play into what you're seeing in terms of cultural intelligence understanding in England?
Yeah, well, there's the tension. There's two sides of the coin, right? On the one hand, I think there's just a more understanding of what it means to live in a globalized society in England. Like you're saying, because of England being part of the Commonwealth, of having colonial roots all over the world, but also just the diversity of people that now find themselves living in England. Even my mom's own family, her story is that she was born in the diaspora, born and raised in Uganda, England, when President Idi Amin came to power and waged a genocide against the minorities, including Indians in Uganda. My mom's whole family fled with literally nothing but the clothes on their back. My mom went to India for college, and the rest of her family moved here to England. And that's true for a lot of Indians, a lot of reasons why they came back to England, if you will. But there's also like a high Caribbean population, which a lot of Black Caribbeans came to England post World War II, as well as just people from around the world. So there is a big immigrant, big globalized demographic. But I think in their own way, England is asking similar questions of like, what does it mean to culturally adapt and what does it mean to preserve culture, right? Like unlike America, where we're celebrating 250 years, right? England has existed for thousands of years with a very distinct like culture. So what does it mean for a small island that's existed for thousands of years with a very specific culture to preserve its culture as it globalizes and diversifies? So it's, similar but different conversations happening over here too.
I wonder then how you see that playing out between what you're seeing in England and what you have experienced in the United States. How was the
Yeah.
way I was framing this as you were talking? It seems like, I guess maybe the question is, do you feel like the British people sort of generally are asking questions about culture in a way that Americans aren't? Like, does it feel like they are more interested in trying to connect across cultures in their society, or in I'm
Good
using big
question.
words because I'm not
Yeah.
familiar with British
Yes.
culture, but
You know,
do you see
I
any
would
sort of differences there?
well, what I would say just briefly is there's a running joke that like British people just apologize for everything. And that's different from Scottish culture or Irish culture or even Welsh culture. Like Brits are incredibly apologetic about everything, you know. So we had friends over for dinner the other day and they were like, "Oh, can you pass the salt? I'm so sorry." Or, "Can I have another glass of water? I'm so sorry." And we were like, "Why are you apologizing just for like existing?" And that same kind of apologetic posture does cross over into English history and colonization and the Commonwealth. Like everything is just constantly like, "We're so sorry. We're like, we feel awful. Like we just constantly feel guilty for our past and for what we did and for how we treated other people's." So I think that's different, right? In terms of, on the one hand, with people in the UK, I think people in Europe in general, there is like strong national pride. Like they're very proud to be English, proud of their football culture, proud of like pub culture, English food, you know, whether it's sausages and potatoes or what, like they're very proud of parts of their English culture and they're also very apologetic for their past. And I do think that there are some of that posture that Americans could also learn from of like how do we be proud of being American and like the good parts of American culture and history, while also being apologetic for the things that America has done and not confuse or conflate being apologetic for problematic aspects of our past with being anti-American or hating America. I think sometimes Americans get tripped up and just mix all of that together.
Yeah, that's a good note. It also, as we're talking about this, it's probably worth noting that that's probably not the experience of everyone in England. Just
Yeah.
thinking back to a period where, with Brexit, like of exiting the European Union and those connections, like there's obviously some portion of British society that does not feel that way. That feels like maybe that national pride becomes more nationalism, and
Yeah.
we are us, and we need to be separate from others who are not us.
Oh, for sure. I mean, England, like English people are very, very clear that they're not Europe. They're the UK and Europe is the continent and they do not like being called Europeans. So there's like just that kind of identity part. I will say it was interesting when we moved here last fall. We were so confused as we rented our car and were driving from the airport to our Airbnb that we were initially staying at, that it seemed like all the streets of Birmingham were just lined with flags, you know, the Union Jack flag and then like all the like the England flag and whatnot. And there has been a big backlash recently of anti-illegal immigration in England. And so obviously that conversation is happening here as well and trying to figure out how, you know, where are we supposed to stand when it comes to immigrants, welcoming immigrants? What's the stance on illegal immigration, people crossing borders illegally, things like that, and for the churches and pastors that we're connected with here, that's a big conversation is how do we pastor our churches and our local people through that conversation. So yeah, they're not immune to that by any means.
Yeah. So when I think about having those conversations, especially here on the podcast, it does get into going back to foundational elements, fundamentals, if you will.
Mm,
And I think you do that well in your book, Becoming All Things, in terms of describing what culture is. It's a word that we use but maybe don't necessarily have either a shared definition or maybe even a working definition all the time. How would
yes.
you define what culture is? What does culture look like?
Yeah. Well, speaking to that confusion, I think, you know, because of other specific Christian spaces like Andy Crouch talking about culture making, it can get very confused as to like, okay, what is culture in terms of like your identity and your story, right? And so these are these are two very different conversations. Culture as culture making, which is like things that we produce as a society, versus what I'm talking about in terms of culture in my book and in my work, which is your culture as your unique story and style, which is all about how you view the world and how you make your way through the world, if you will, or interact with the people in the world. It, your culture is what makes you inherently you from the inside out, if you will. And you know, being that I'm an ethnic minority and I talk with a lot of other folks who are either ethnic minorities or identify as cultural outsiders, understanding what your culture is can be a very difficult thing. I was talking with a black man recently who actually said, you know, I feel too black for my white friends, but I actually feel too white for my black friends, like that bicultural tension. And many Asian Americans like myself also have that struggle of like, we're too brown to be seen as white, but we're not brown enough for our ethnic communities. Like I grew up having Indians from India tell me I was not a real Indian because I wasn't like 100%. And so then we get into these like situations where we're wondering like who am I and like do I belong and where do I fit and I think that's why as I share in my book Becoming All Things that it's really helpful for us to see ourselves and people in general as unique individuals that our culture is a unique blend of our backgrounds and you know influences from our family where we grew up our faith and the more that we can see our culture in terms of like our unique individual makeup, the better that we'll be able to just embrace who we are in all of our complexities. The better we can see and appreciate other people as well, as opposed to trying to force ourselves into really strict categories that no longer fit for our global diverse society.
Yeah. I wonder what you think then about sort of an individual view versus a collective view. And I think what I mean by that is it is probably easiest for ourselves to understand ourselves as an individual when
Mhm.
viewing that against everyone who we might interact with. And then it becomes more difficult to or it can be more difficult to see other people as individuals when we're trying like our brain tries to build categories for us to help us just get through life to sort of provide an ease of brain functioning or whatever else it
Yeah.
is. Thinking
Yeah.
about that as an American, it's I have struggled sometimes to feel like individualism has done great things, like it has been helpful in a lot of ways for our country, but it also
Mhm.
feels super detrimental when we try to come together while trying to maintain that strong individual, like I am doing things for myself.
Yeah.
How do we think about understanding culture nationally, societally, when we have such a strong individual perspective?
It's a great question. I think, um, like, I would answer that different depending on social location, but you know, statistically, the fastest diversifying countries or continents really are North America and Europe, right? So Canada, United States, European countries, they're the fastest diversifying countries around the world, which I think is where it is more helpful to see people as unique cultural individuals because we are such like products of our globalized societies in a way that perhaps somebody who grew up in the favelas of Brazil might not be, you know, like a multicultural or identify as a global citizen kind of thing. So I think there's that, right? Is understanding your social location and understanding whether you grew up in a monocultural versus multicultural community, the influences around you. Um, so I don't know if that answers your question, Eric, but I think knowing that yeah, knowing that I mean 19, I'm thinking about like the 1950s, right? When like academic research around culture was really groundbreaking. You have Hofstede talking about the six cultural dimensions and things like that. And th this was really groundbreaking because it was like, oh, okay, we're not all the same, right? That was the big realization at that time. different cultures have different values and behavioral preferences, and like we need to understand, okay, Africans are not the same as Asians, and Asians are not the same as Germans, and so on and so forth. But I think when we still continue to see people in those like large nationalistic cultural categories, that's where people start to feel like, wait, I don't fit that anymore, or wait, I'm a mix of this and I'm a mix of that. This no, we're kind of picking and choosing. So I think it is hard to talk about American culture from like a broad stroke of like this is American culture because we are so diversified. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's just what comes to mind.
Well, at the very least, I think it's some beginnings of generating conversation
Yeah.
in that way. You mentioned social location, and I wonder how much that plays into. I've been thinking a lot recently about power, who holds power, how does power
Mhm.
especially fit into understandings of race? How does power fit into, or social location fit into understanding our culture? Because you talk a lot, I think appropriately, about a difference between white Christians who are coming to think about this, and I guess maybe everyone else could be like a second category of that.
Yeah.
How does power fit into this?
Yes, yes. Oh man, great question. I think um your understanding of power is directly dependent on whether or not you grew up in a dominant culture or not, right? If you grew up in a monocultural community where everyone looks like you, where everyone thinks like you, your understanding of power and agency is going to be very different than if you grew up like me as a minority where nobody was like me. I knew I was different from day one. And so my very first life lessons were all about how do I, like, I know I'm not the norm. How do I adapt to fit in so I can survive, right? Like if you grew up in a monocultural community where that's not the case, you don't know the struggle of being different, right? And that impacts you in so many ways. I think about I was guest lecturing at Moody Bible Institute a few months ago, and somebody even asked me, they're like, why are, when it comes to race conversations, why are people always giving so much, like, why are people giving white Christians such a hard time, right? And we had to unpack this idea that, like, well, when it comes to these conversations, yes, everyone needs to be at the table, everyone needs to be like in the work and committed to the work and like working towards unity and equality, but we have different starting points and different levels of awareness. Like I said, for myself, growing up as a minority, I was very culturally self-aware at a very early age. Whereas I think for some white folks, they may have not met their first like black person or Indian or Latino until they went to college, right? And so like that curve of learning and awareness is just it's at a lower point. And then if you're a part of the dominant culture, you may not feel the need to have to adapt because you don't feel like your survival is dependent upon it, right? And I think that's oftentimes then where apathy comes into play. And well, you know, I don't have to adapt to thrive in this place, so why should I? Right? Whereas the minority is like, how do I adapt so that I can like survive? So all of these come into play when you think about power and dynamics and who needs to fit the mold, who's already the mold, and why, and I think part of the question, particularly when it comes to cultural intelligence, and effectively interacting with people who are different from you, like the core, the foundation of cultural intelligence is like desire and drive and like getting people to care. And I think a question that we've overlooked for a very long time and what's made diversity conversations so difficult is why should someone who's in the dominant culture care about adapting to the minority? And yes, there are like, biblical examples that we could go to. We could talk about, the body of Christ and like caring for the weaker members of the body and things like that and being part of a unified whole. But I think that's a question that we need to talk about more is why should white folks in general and white Christians, why should they care? What's their desire? What's going to tap into their drive to adapt across cultures to get them at the table that's something beyond just like trying to fear monger and shame people into engaging because we know that that approach is not working.
Yes, and it probably shouldn't work the way that there's enough conversation about shame. Thanks to Brene Brown and others for bringing that into uh, a
Yeah.
much more common understanding of that is not a great way to actually effectively motivate people. So
Yes.
then I wonder how you begin to answer that question. What is the reason? What are effective ways, and what is the reason to encourage people to think about engaging cross culturally?
Yeah. Well, I think, particularly when it comes to white Christians, Eric, I'd say that we have to start with the good, both in terms of uh, the goodness in their God-given cultural identities, right? I think we're at a point, speaking of the United States socially, where there's so much fear and guilt around being white, like white shame, right? Like that if you are white, that you have to feel ashamed of yourself in some way. And I think that we have conflated the race conversation with the culture conversation, and that's unhelpful, right? And so teasing that back apart, if race is all about like social constructs and man-made hierarchies of superiority and inferiority between humans, we can talk about culture as like a God-given a God-given design where we each have our own unique ethnicity, background, story, where we're all supposed to exist as equal. Like that's God's vision for a diverse, ethnic group, if you will. And so, uh, if we can first tease that out and encourage people to see the goodness in their cultural identities and to engage from a place of confidence and joy, like that's huge, right? And then being able to say, empower particular dominant culture folks, what is the good that you can do? What's the good that you can come alongside of, right? Like, how can you make a difference, right? Like, that's the kind of conversation that brings white people to the table, not, you need to take ownership for 250 years of colonizer history, and your voice isn't as important as anyone else's. Like that's gonna scare them away, right? So start with the good, start with the beautiful, start with what God intended before then talking about the good gone wrong.
Yeah. From what I'm hearing you say, I want to address an idea that could come up, I think, of this being a one directional equation, if you will,
Hmm.
of this we figure out who we are so that we can bring ourselves to other people exclusively rather than there being like a back and forth flow of interaction.
Oh
What are
yeah.
ways that we can think about that? Like what beyond we are doing this so we can go out into the world or whatever, what beyond that is there to understand from this conversation?
Yes. Well, to that point, it's funny how in moving to England, I've realize that there are some American traits that I have that back in the States I would have never named as American traits, if you will. And one of them is just that like spirit of innovation and like entrepreneurship, if you will. It's so funny how here in England, if something goes wrong, like if something doesn't work out, the general response is, oh well, well, it wasn't meant to be, or bummer, or, you know, sorry, everyone. It's just like, and that's it. There's no like plan B or like let's redirect or let's see what other opportunity we can explore. It's just like, well, didn't work out, sorry. And I have noticed so many times in me that frustration of like, what? We're just gonna like quit? We're just gonna throw our hands up and not like try something else? Like, are you kidding me? And then I realized, like, wow, that's very American of me. That like, if the door closes, we're going to open the window kind of thing. And so that's my long way of saying that sometimes we will not understand ourselves culturally unless we are around people who are different from us, right? So I think just for anyone who's at a point where they want to know themselves better and they're like, I'm tired of feeling culturally ignorant. I'm tired of not understanding what my cultural identity is. I want to know, where do I start? Like, obviously, yes, there's tons of books out there that you can read on culture, but sometimes the best like teacher is just interacting with people who are different from you and seeing like what that brings up, the emotions, the like, that mirror is so powerful. So I think there's that. But I think, kind of to your deeper question, Eric, is just whether it's the conversation of like cross-cultural engagement or even like cultural intelligence, which I would define as the ability to effectively interact with people who are different from us, right? Like, obviously, there's the conversation, and I write about this in my book about like the missiological importance of that, like how that's important for our witness and for spreading the gospel. CQ is a growing conversation in leadership circles because of globalizing teams and globalizing organizations. So obviously CQ is important for leaders today, but I think just in general for the average person, like being culturally adaptable, being culturally intelligent is a necessary tool to just be a good human. And like we've been talking about, just especially anyone who's living in the United States or Europe or Canada, like we are living in incredibly fast diversifying countries, and the biggest demographic even of the next generation is bicultural, multicultural, cross-cultural marriages, I think, are the fastest growing marriages right now. So the next generation is going to be even more diverse than it is now. I think there's even some statistics about how like by 2050 there might be more, like United States might be more brown than white. So there's a lot of cultural change happening now and it's going to happen in the next couple of decades. And it's far more likely for us to be interacting on a daily basis with someone who's different from us than it would have been even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So I think the question is like, are you prepared? Can you confidently and effectively interact or engage across difference? Because that's now going to be like everyone's survival tool, and it's going to be part of what it means to be a good human now and even more so moving forward.
Yeah. I'm curious, you brought up thinking about this missiologically in a way, to maybe if we can turn the conversation somewhat in that direction and what this means specifically for Christians versus maybe a secular understanding or secular society. One
Yeah.
of the things I'm curious about is how you use Paul in the book to sort of talk about this cross-cultural interaction. How did you, I mean, even to the point where I think becoming all things pulls out of this the verses you use from First Corinthians 9 from Paul. How did you come to use Paul sort of as a framework for building your maybe not argument, building the conversation, if you will?
Yeah. 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 I love that question. One, because I'm rarely asked that question, so that's kind of fun. But two, honestly, it just came, and this had to have been back in like 2016, 2017. Was just reading through the epistles and came across those verses of First Corinthians 9, and I remember being like, "This is me." I think I probably even shouted something like that aloud. I went and grabbed my husband. I'm like, this is what we're doing. Like, this is us. Like, what in the world? And that it wasn't the first time I'd read that passage, but back in 2016, 2017, my husband and I, we were in the throes of church planting and doing cross-cultural ministry. And particularly in the community we were in, which was a very impoverished black and brown community, where there's a lot of immigrants, undocumented, black and brown, speaking different languages. It just felt like our everyday life was becoming all things to all people, like that cultural chameleon type lifestyle. And I was like, this is us. And that's where then the impetus of like, I need to talk more about the life that we're living and the way in which I've learned over time to go from adapting for the sake of survival to actually still being able to adapt from a place of authenticity, of like still being myself, and still and adapting for a greater purpose, if you will. And so yeah, that's kind of the genesis of why that passage, and just how it was dovetailing with our life at that time, and felt like, hey, I want to write more about this, and what we're experiencing and working through.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mention using that for survival because I just finished reading Jesus and the Disinherited from Howard Thurman
Mm,
over the weekend. And he
wow.
talks about how there are different things that are used for survival that like eventually end up eating us away as like attributes or processes or whatnot. And then the sort of the way to turn on that. So that's not necessarily where I want to bring the conversation here, but that's just like consistently in the back of my mind at this moment is that sort of a
Yeah.
what are things that we use to try and survive that actually like were effective 10,000 years ago when we were trying to run away from big game, whereas now like inhibits our interactions with other people.
Yes, 100%. And I think code switching is part of that, right? And that for so many ethnic minorities, and I'd say by extension, cultural outsiders, that is the question still, is like, how do I stop faking it till I make it, right? Like, how do I just be myself and be respected and, authentically show up in places? And I think that is a question we still need to ask ourselves. I do think that in some ways, code switching is the dark underbelly of cultural adaptation, because as I argue in my book, being able to adapt ourselves culturally is a skill and it's a necessary tool for our life today. But code switching is like shrinking ourselves. It's like muting, hiding, becoming invisible. That's not what you want. You don't want to adapt and lose yourself in the process, right? You want to be able to, instead of shrink, you want to expand. You want to understand who you are at your core and what authenticity means to you, and then expand out your skill set for adaptable language and behavior purely for the sake of effectively interacting with people, um, without somehow losing yourself in that process. So I think still being able to have that conversation of code switching versus cultural adaptation, how to do the one without the other, like to your point, is so that we don't like go crazy, in the process, is incredibly important.
Yeah, I feel like you talk about that sort of specifically in the context of a lot of this conversation ends up being for white Christians, and there's a way white Christians can think about this. But then for
Mm,
people who are not white Christians, for people who may come from either minority backgrounds, uh, and any sort of uh, distinction like that I'm forgetting in the moment of how to phrase,
yeah.
that there is a difference there for that group of people that I think you just that code switching conversation is part of that. Is there anything else for uh, anyone who is not in that sort of immediate like societal power white Christian area that is a part of this conversation that you feel like we should talk about here?
Oh, that's a great question. Do you mean like in terms of other aspects of cultural adaptation for ethnic minorities, or?
Something along those lines. I think it comes back to that. How do you maintain your sense of self and sense of uh, there is a way in which culture adaptation, which turns into code switching, means that my culture is bad. I must
Yeah.
change to dominant culture in order to survive, like we were just talking about.
Yes,
How do you
yes.
maintain the sense of self and the sense of cultural worth, I guess?
Yes. Yeah, 100%. Well, and just to add, I often like using the term cultural outsider even beyond just ethnic minority because I do work with a lot of folks that are either identify as white, who either because of where they've lived really don't identify with the main kind of mainstream thinking and lifestyle and behavior of like white Americans. Maybe they've lived abroad, maybe they grew up in an urban context or in a black community or something like that. And so it's like they're more ethnic minority than they are white in terms of like how they live their life, or even maybe they're part of they grew up lower class, right? Like class is such an interesting conversation too when it comes to like the culture intersection, because white working class lives far more similarly to like black and brown communities than wealthy white. So that's a whole aspect too. So
Yeah,
I think
just
culture, yeah,
to break in briefly, that is one of the aspects of race that is not discussed, is how race was created, not just to
yes,
maintain supremacy over a certain color skin, but also over white people who had less power and less influence than the ruling class, ruling majority, or ruling minority, I
yes,
guess. So that's maybe not a
yes.
that's its own podcast conversation probably, but something to keep in mind as we're talking about it.
Yeah, well, and I guess just to dig a little deeper, often so many white working class families that we know that we interacted with both in the States and here in England, their homes are often multi-generational, right? Like you have the grandparents, the parents, the grandkids all living under one roof, and they share a collective identity. So if one person does something, they're all going to do it, right? Like if one person starts coming to church, they're all going to come to church. Or, birthday parties or gatherings. It's highly collective, big, big gatherings. So there's that, and I think that's also why it is important to distinguish between multi-ethnicity and multiculturalism, right? Because we've seen a lot of churches in the States, for example, that are multi-ethnic, but if they're all of, say, an upper middle class kind of socioeconomic bracket, they really still all share the same dominant white American culture, and they've lost some of that like distinctive ethnic cultural backgrounds versus multiculturalism, which is the existence of different cultural norms and behaviors, and even like worldviews coming together in a space. And that's a much harder place to create that kind of unity and diversity atmosphere. But yeah, I'm sure we could discuss that far more in depth. But I think if for folks listening in who are really passionate about conversations on race and culture, class has to be a part of it. Like that needs to be the kind of the third strand of this conversation because it influences these conversations in so many ways.
Yeah. Coming back to the missiological perspective of this, of the becoming all
Yes.
things to all people, as Paul describes, this is a little bit of a personal pet question, I think. But as someone who grew up inside of evangelicalism, there is a
Mhm.
huge emphasis on sort of this winning other people for Christ, the presentation of the gospel message to people in order to bring people into church, into Christianity and whatnot. And I think you there's a tension there with there's a way that happens which ultimately ends up being dehumanizing, where you're not seeing other people as individuals, as human beings. You're seeing them as statistics, essentially. Uh, the,
Right,
my words, I guess we can
right.
say is where what that is. So there is this sense where we are called to spread the message of the gospel, and a way to do that effectively is to become all things to all people, to build this cross-cultural intelligence.
Yeah.
How do we do that while maintaining that understanding of other people's humanity? How do
Yes.
we fight the urge to focus solely on the spreading of the message? And I guess ultimately it is how do we understand this not just as cross cultural understanding as a tool we use to be more effective purveyors of the gospel? How do we hold that
Yeah.
tension?
Oh, this is such a great question because I work with a lot of not just pastors and churches, but also missionaries who are still frustrated with the way their organizations, have sort of their gospel and witness plan, which oftentimes, especially if it's in other countries, is still very much like we're going to teach it to them in English, like we're going to expect them to learn English so they can understand our gospel presentation, or like it's going to be very much heavily American culture influenced and expecting the local culture to adapt to fit the American model, which is very different from, how Christianity is practiced around the world, or just religion in general. And so that's, I think, still a big flaw of expecting people to adapt to us, of Americans, white Christians, American missionaries, pastors, churches, like still having this idea of like the Kevin Costner, if we build it, they will come, right? Like we stay in our comfort zone, they come to us, we get them into our funnel of visitor to congregant to, leadership pipeline, but it's like slowly adapting them more and more to our culture. And I think to really be culturally intelligent, to be effective across cultures, we have to flip that script. We have to want to go to them. And it should always be relationally based, right? Like we can't have a business first model for gospel witness. That just goes sideways in so many ways. But I think about how much good and how much positive change would happen if our missiological uh, impetus was led by just breaking bread around tables in people's homes, right? And not just our home, but us going to other people's homes, eating their food, learning their stories, getting to know them on their turf, and then engaging them in their places of community and whatnot. And so, for example, the church that we're at right now in England, where my husband serves as the lead pastor, it's again, it's a very working class community, and a lot of the men in the community, what what does their day look like? They go to work all day, and then after work they get off and they go to the pub, right? Like that's like, big pub culture. And so it's, we've had the conversation of, well, why would we have a Bible study at church where we then tell them to not go to their pub, which is so like built into the culture and their lifestyle, and tell them to come to church for Bible study instead? Why not just have Bible study at the pub? You know what I mean? And be okay with pints of beer and the men playing darts while reading the book of Mark, or whatnot. But I think that's the idea of how do we flip the script, lead with relationships, and meet people where they're at as opposed to expecting them to come to us.
Yeah. We're getting closer on time, and I have so many other things I want to talk about. it's, we'll try and maybe we'll try and cram in multiple things, but one thing I think I want to
Nice.
get to is the understanding of, I think, again, coming out of evangelical cultural practice and background, there is a way in which we interrogate is something Christian or not that
Mm,
I feel like can be appropriate, but in practice ends up becoming anything that is different from my experience and my cultural understanding and approach to Christianity is wrong, and not only
yeah.
wrong, then is unbiblical, unchristian, potentially
Yes.
sinful. How is it appropriate first to ask that question when we see cultural practices that are different from ourselves or from our own? Is there a point where that becomes appropriate? Like at a, I don't know what sort of a level you would think of that as. Like, is there a point where that does become appropriate? And then how do you interact with something is just different? It's not bad, it's not sinful, it is just different from the way that I would do something.
Yes. Oh, 100%. I think this is actually where having a higher level of cultural awareness, and specifically having the language of cultural values and cultural preferences is incredibly important because when you're able to see people through a cultural lens, you can interpret situations in a much more neutral light. Like you said, instead of interpreting it as somebody is lazy or mean or heretical, you can say, oh, okay, they're bringing this cultural lens and it's different from mine, but it's not right or wrong, it's just different. And one big example is that, certain cultures around the world are high honor shame cultures. Indian culture can be like that, Asian cultures in general, and even African cultures as well. And so, how this translates, say, for example, you're a church in the United States and you hire an Asian or African pastor, whether it's the lead pastor, associate pastor, or whatnot. He gets up and preaches a sermon and it is heavy on sin and the consequences of sin and repent, because the kingdom of God is at hand and you have to repent of your sins to come to Christ. And I know of that scenario in so many, I've heard this scenario from so many different people where the white congregants in the church are like, what is wrong with the pastor? Like, why are you not talking more about God's love and God's grace and how God says, just come as you are and he will accept you? The whole prodigal son thing. And they're kind of like, we don't like the pastor's sermons. And you're like, okay, well, from a white American context, I could see how this would be very like disruptive. But from an Asian context where honor shame is huge and like sin impacts the whole and the sin, sin is not just like a private thing. It's how you're perceived within the entire community, and that you wouldn't want to sin if you truly love God, right? Like duty and honor and all these things kind of come together. You're like, oh, okay. This isn't like some misinterpretation or misuse of scripture. Like this is a very specific person with a very specific cultural lens sharing their understanding of faith, which might differ. And I think I honestly think, Eric, that when it comes to cultural awareness, the goal isn't to change the other person and be like, well, the way I preach is right and the way you preach is wrong, but it's more like, oh, okay, I can understand where they're coming from. I might not say it the same way, or I might not approach this text in that same way, but I can see where they're coming from. Okay. I'll do me, you do you kind of thing, and we can coexist peacefully. To me, that is a much better understanding of unity and diversity, and a much better way to understand theological differences. But without that cultural lens, we will be more quick to say like this is heretical or this is wrong, as opposed to increasing our tolerance for difference.
Yeah. I think my last question here, being the Biblical Justice Resources podcast, is a focus on what resources to help people continuing outside of this. So, I mean, we could probably give out dozens of book suggestions or not. But one of the things I think has been interesting following you on Instagram has been your conversations about being a coach in this sort of a way. And how it seems like we talked earlier about some of the best way to do this in practice is to interact with other people. And I think a coach could be helpful in that. I'm curious, it may end up being to the point where not everyone can have you as their coach. But I'm curious what you would say if someone does want to find a person like that to help walk alongside them in learning more about this. what are qualities that someone should look for in a coach that will help them as they're kind of continuing on learning in this journey?
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking that, and I appreciate the shout out. Yeah, the work that I do as an intercultural leadership coach is to help both individual leaders and teams develop the language of culture so that they can, effectively and confidently engage across difference without fear or guilt. And that really does stem from understanding your strengths, your communication style, how you show up through a cultural lens, right? Like being able to name, oh, okay. This is why I am the way that I am, right? This is why this excites me. This is why this like feels soul sucking, but using the language of culture to explain that. And once you're able to come to a point of that deeper cultural awareness, self-awareness, then you can actually build a leadership style around that helps you communicate who you are, be respected for who you are, move a team forward in positive directions. And so, yeah, I think in terms of coaching, what where we're at right now, post 2020, George Floyd, the summer of 2020, and all the conversations around race and culture, is I think people have had their fill on like generic books and trainings on culture and race. The gap that we still have is how to personalize that to us as individuals, to our context, to our unique struggles. And so I think for anyone who's looking for a coach, you want that type of support. You want very like personalized, customized support. Someone who's going to understand you and your cultural makeup and say, okay, based off of who you are, this is how you need to show up. Here's your gaps, here's your strengths, here's how we can build a plan around it. I think anything that sniffs of generalized support, like we're past that. There's enough information of that. We need personal support right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good identification.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Reyes, for all of that. I enjoyed having this conversation here with you today.
Oh, thank you. I feel like I could talk with you for hours, Eric, and I'm with you. I feel like maybe we just skimmed the surface, and there's so much more to this conversation. But I'm really grateful for your thoughtful questions.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.